How quickly is the US national debt growing? Is it increasing at an increasing rate? This is a story that came out on February 12th, 2019. The national debt hits a new milestone, topping 22 trillion. So lately I've been thinking about, now that we're seeing these record national debt numbers, it seems faster and faster, how quickly this is actually happening. So I went back and did some research for you guys to benefit from. Factors for growth of the US's national debt. Growth of the U.S.'s national debt depends on the size of annual federal government budget deficits, how much in annual tax revenues is brought in by the U.S. Treasury, and what interest rates the U.S. Treasury is paying on the national debt, as interest expense and interest payments on the debt are very important. For example, if interest rates are 1%, then the U.S. federal government would pay $220 billion in interest. That would add to the national debt on its $22 trillion in total outstanding debt, also called the principal amount. If interest rates are 2%, then the federal government would owe $440 billion in interest payments on the $22 trillion national debt. So that's an example. The larger the debt grows, the more of the annual federal budget will be used for interest payments on the national debt, unless interest rates are manipulated down to zero or the debt is fully monetized by the Federal Reserve. But that brings a bunch of additional problems doing financial repression and monetization of debt, which is often what emerging market countries do. This is a chart I just saw in a recent Zero Hedge article that came out on May 1st about federal government expenditures, interest payments on debt. We are approaching $600 billion for the full year of interest payments. Interest payments on debt were not rising super rapidly until after the tech bubble, and then they collapsed again right before the 2008 financial crisis, and then they started going skyrocketing higher and higher and higher. The long-term trend is obviously higher. This is summarizing the Zero Hedge article I found today, which was from May 1st. The article is called Endgame. Starting in 2024, all of the U.S. debt issuance will be used to pay for interest on debt. I'm summarizing the article here with some bullet points. As part of a recent Treasury presentation to the Treasury Borrowing Advisory Committee, there is a chart showing the Office of Debt Management's forecast for annual U.S. debt issuance, broken down between its three component uses of funds: primary deficit, net interest expense, and other. What few people know is the increasingly ominous composition of this budget deficit, resulting in recurring bond trader nightmares about funding the growing twin U.S. deficits, budget, and current account. So there are other countries like China doing this as well, but this video is about the U.S. When looking at the U.S.'s income statement, most concerning by far is that for the first 4 months of fiscal year 2019, interest payments on the U.S. national debt hit $221 billion, 9% more than in the same 5-month period last year. As a reminder, according to the Treasury's conservative budget estimates, interest on the U.S. public debt is on track to reach a record $591 billion this fiscal year, more than the entire budget deficit in financial year 2014, which was $483 billion, or financial year 2015, which was $439 billion. And those years were heavy financial repression, and equates to almost 3% of estimated GDP, the highest percentage since 2011. Also remember, the interest rates were not being raised those years by past Fed Chairman Janet Yellen and Ben Bernanke. The real red flag is that starting in 2024, according to estimates, when the primary deficit drops to zero, according to the latest projections, the primary deficit's going to drop to zero. They're assuming it, though, so I'm covering it. All U.S. debt issuance will be used to fund the U.S. net interest expense, which, depending on the prevailing interest rate between now and then, will be anywhere between $700 billion and $1.2 trillion or more. In short, in the stylized cycle of the U.S.'s Minsky moment, the U.S. will enter the penultimate Ponzi finance phase, the one in which all the new debt issuance is used to fund only interest on the debt sometime around in 2024, or will the U.S. find new ways to delay this further out past 2024? So I added that question there. And if you're issuing new debt to pay off the old debt, it's kind of like opening up new credit cards to kind of pay off the old ones. So you're stealing from Peter to pay Paul, similar to that. It's real bad subprime borrowing. This is one of the slides I'm talking about with the OMB's projection of borrowing from the public. Notice how in 2024, it assumes that a lot of the debt issuance will be just for net interest. It's the one highlighted in red. That's the main thing about this slide. This is a chart that I got from the Treasury Direct website, and it shows how much the debt has grown in the last 18 or 19 years. So we have around fourfold growth in 18 years. So every year the debt might not go up a lot, but the long-term trend is much higher. And obviously, This is a problem from Republicans and Democrats. This is not to blame on one particular president or another, or one Fed chairman necessarily or another, although I do place a lot of blame on Greenspan and Bernanke. But it is a giant mess. So this is growth of the U.S. national debt since 2007. I found this on the great website called usgovernmentspending.com. That guy tracks these things up to date. He has a really good free website. So the federal debt increased sharply in response to the Great Recession of 2006 to 2008, with debt rising from $9 trillion in 2007 to $15 trillion in 2011. Federal debt continues to increase about $1 trillion per year. So that was the main question I was asking before I wanted to do this video and started doing the research. Was we see all these headlines that the national debt is 18 trillion, 19 trillion, 20 trillion, 21, 22, but how quick is the national debt actually growing? And the answer is, as of right now, the national debt is growing at about $1 trillion per year, regardless of which president, from which political party, or how broken Congress is. At the end of financial year 2018, federal debt was 21.46 trillion, but now we're over 22 trillion. What's the U.S.'s current debt to GDP ratio? Viewed as percent of GDP, the increase in federal debt is not so startling, unless you assume that GDP is phony or pure fiction to keep borrowing costs lower than they should be. But federal debt has still increased from 60% of GDP to over 100% of GDP in less than 10 years, and has remained at about 100% of GDP since 2012. At the end of financial year 2018, the federal debt was 104.7% of GDP. So this is a chart of the annual U.S. federal government tax receipts in the last decade. And notice there, I put the big red arrow that you can see through the transparent one, that the tax revenues were a lot higher prior to the 2009, and they collapsed a lot, almost 50% collapse in 2009, down to barely $1.1 trillion. And now, if you check this out, the annual tax revenues are right around, give or take. Sometimes they're a little bit higher in the last couple of years, and sometimes they're a little bit lower. The annual U.S. tax revenues that the Treasury gets are around $2 trillion. But the point I wanted to make with this slide showing you guys this is that the 2009 collapse in tax revenues by almost 50% is what the U.S. government fears the most, and why you have so much intervention by central banks and governments lying, trying to manipulate asset prices higher of real estate prices, stocks, bonds, etc. How can the growth in the U.S.'s national debt be stopped? The long answer: if politicians from both political parties work together to drastically cut federal government spending, both welfare and warfare, and size of the bureaucracy, then the growth in federal government national debt could slow down from its current growth rate. Taxing the economy more, even taxing a lot more, also won't make a dent in the total outstanding debt. Plus, it could potentially totally collapse the economy and cause more productive economic activity to cease, thus drastically lowering annual tax revenues. So if the Bernie Sanders or some of these other politicians at the federal, state, or local level drastically raise taxes, it could temporarily bring in more revenue, but long-term it is not a solution because it will make things worse. You'll have people leaving the state of Illinois, or leaving like corporations and small businesses, and rich people leaving the state of California. Well, not every rich person is leaving California, but a lot of corporations and small business owners are. The short answer for all of this is it won't happen. For the growth in national debt, it won't. They won't stop it because politicians from both political parties don't care about the long-term ramifications of running perpetual deficits, as long as interest payments on the national debt can be made. Democrats are tax, borrow, and spend. Republicans are borrow and spend. These are some economic cartoons that tell the story accurately of how broken Congress is and some of the other problems with the national debt. So basically, both political parties, they agree that they want to rape and pillage the taxpayer. They agree that they want to spend money. They just disagree normally on what to spend it on. And this is a really great political cartoon here about both political parties, how the taxpayer and the people are often screwed by both. And unfortunately, this is what happens in a two-party system, and an enormous federal bureaucracy and waste, fraud, corruption, and abuse pervasive throughout the entire system. And then we have moral decay and moral bankruptcy running pervasive and throughout, and getting worse every year throughout pretty much everything in American culture and American society. This is Congress. This is true. This is Congress's solution to the debt ceiling problem. They just raise the debt ceiling. They don't actually cut any spending. See, this is House of Cards. Congress's solution to the debt problem again, right? They just raise the debt ceiling and it's a house of cards. So they don't care about the long-term problems as long as the interest payments on the debt can be made, and they're going to get rich quick here in DC. They're going to go from being worth a couple $100,000 or almost zero to worth $5 million or $10 million in a very short amount of time. As Peter Schweitzer said in his book, secret empires and talking about corruption in his new book. This is another really great economic cartoon. I've already showed you guys it. So the plumbing is broken and look what it's leaking. Why fix the plumbing when we can just raise the debt ceiling? The plumbing is broken. The bureaucracy is broken. Congress is broken. There are so many systems at the federal, state, and local level that are broken. This is a summary of not just the stated national debt, so the U.S. federal government off-balance sheet and unfunded liabilities. This is a summary of things if you want to do more research. The U.S. federal government doesn't count many expenditures as part of the national debt, including a full rebuilding of the Houston, Texas area post-Hurricane Harvey and parts of Florida and Alabama post-Hurricane Michael. Some experts estimate that there's an additional $10 to $12 trillion already in off-balance sheet debt to add to the current $22 trillion. So real official national debt should be around $35 trillion already if the U.S. was using GAAP, generally accepted accounting principles, and that's not counting the unfunded liabilities that I'm going to talk about in a second. So will the U.S. states that are in financial trouble get bailed out? Almost all of them are Democrat. So you're New York, New Jersey, Illinois, California, Michigan, those ones seem to be in the worst shape in the near term, but a lot of states in the long term have a lot of problems, including unfunded pension liabilities. So will state and local pension funds that are drastically underfunded also get bailed out? This would add trillions to the U.S.'s national debt as well. And there's on top of this, and this is not just a U.S. problem, although the U.S. is such a large country and economy, but this is a global problem. There is a global pension fund crisis of estimated $400 trillion by 2050. So all these politicians in many different countries have drastically overpromised people, government employees, and other people about their retirements that they would get funded in exchange for votes, buying votes. Professor of economics at Boston University, Lawrence Kotlikoff, estimates that the U.S. federal government has over $200 trillion in net present value if the U.S. government used GAAP in unfunded liabilities for Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, etc. However, estimates from other experts about the size of the unfunded liabilities, those unfunded ones, vary to as low as 60 trillion. I tend to be in the Lawrence Kotlikoff camp, but I have seen estimates, like I said, as low as 60 to 70 trillion, and there's a bunch of other estimates in between, but I think Kotlikoff lays that he has them itemized, and I think he's probably the most accurate and honest. Finally, Dr. Mark Skidmore and Catherine Austin Fitts have done extensive research that $21 trillion is missing. The money is legally hidden in a black budget now due to an accounting change by Statement of Federal Financial Accounting Standards 56. You can go to that website, missingmoney.solari.com, and look up all the documents and reports indicating that the money is gone. So this is over the last 20 years, give or take, that the military-industrial complex in Wall Street helped funnel or steal an additional $21 trillion. So it's not in the official national debt, but the money has been created out of thin air and given and spent on God knows what, whether it's black budget military stuff or over-the-counter derivatives putting out fires, we don't know. And there's no transparency here because of the FASB Rule 56 now. In conclusion, the annual U.S. federal government tax receipts for 2018 are just under $2 trillion at $1.959 trillion, according to the St. Louis Federal Reserve website. Annual U.S. federal government tax receipts have stayed close to around $2 trillion per year for the last few years, although their long-term trend is higher, and I said except during official recessions or depressions. And that's what the government is really, really worried about, what the Treasury and the Fed are worried about is a 20%, 30%, 40%, even God forbid a 50% hole in the government budget due to asset prices collapsing. That means an enormous shortfall in capital gains taxes. Although interest payments on the U.S. national debt do not take up 50% of annual tax revenues and are not close to doing so yet, and according to that Zero Hedge article, we're still about 5 or 6 years away. They are growing. So I think we're over 25%, and it's growing very quickly, despite financial repression, manipulation of interest rates due to increase in government spending that is still a long-term trend. Republicans and Democrats are both responsible for the debt growing to these levels for many decades now, with leaders from both parties having no intent to cut federal government spending and its current rate of growth, with the Fed as their enabler. The current growth of the debt may accelerate in the years to come without drastic measures being done. Unfortunately, no politician in a leadership position seems to care. There's only 3 politicians I like in the U.S.'s Congress right now: Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky, Congressman Thomas Massie, and Justin Amash. Those are the only ones willing to tell the truth pretty much all the time. The rest of them are willing to lie, cheat, and steal to get rich quick, or only good sometimes. President Trump wants more quantitative easing and a 1% rate cut in addition to his tax cuts and supply side economic stimulus already done. I went into more why on my live stream recently, last night, given his background in commercial real estate and how successful he was leveraging to the hilt. And then he didn't even have to pay the money back a lot of the times, even when he went bankrupt and other problems. And the banker still gave him more money to borrow eventually, even after bankruptcy. Obama was tax and borrow and spend. George W. Bush and Dick Cheney had their wars, and they gave away massive amounts of free prescription stuff to Medicare Part D in exchange for votes. And Congress seems to become more broken every few years and can only agree on new, wasteful, and corrupt pet spending projects to trade each other for key votes. One of my listeners has talked about this, how if there's actually audio on C-SPAN when they were whipping votes and trading things around, the American people would be an enormous scandal. And that's why there's not really any audio when Congress in the House or Senate is whipping votes. So how long can, quote, stagflate and tax and lie, end quote, go on? It's anybody's guess exactly. It's a fool's errand, I would say, to guess the exact time frame. What happens if Bernie Sanders or one of his puppets wins in the next few presidential elections after Trump and is actually able to apply MMT? So not only is the Fed very worried about the U.S. corporate bond market with interest rates rising, and this is why the Fed probably stopped raising rates, or at least one of the reasons, but they are now very worried about interest payments on the national debt in the coming years, as evidenced by that article in the report that one of the Treasury groups, I forget the exact name, the Office of Debt Management or something, had to make. And the Treasury and Fed people, I'm sure, were present. This is the great compromise that both political parties tend to agree on for decades now. It's been this way for a long, long time. So you can't say, oh, it's only Obama's fault, or, oh, it's only Trump's fault. No, this is both political parties just actively and increasingly raping and pillaging the U.S. taxpayer with inflation and taxes, currency devaluation and taxes, and government spending increasing like crazy. And federal government employees are still getting Cadillac healthcare, good retirements, and they have, I think, a mandatory 1% or 2% salary increase. And while that doesn't sound like a lot for 1 or 2 years over long term, if they're there for many years, they're there for 20 years, that's a 20% salary increase if their salary is going up 1%. It doesn't have to be Obama driving this train, but this train is going, it's a runaway train, and at some point it will go off the tracks. These are my sources that I used for this short video. I highly recommend checking out the U.S. government spending website. I think it's great. It's free, and the guy actively updates it with charts and graphs and analysis, and I think he does a good job. Okay, usdebtclock.org and the Treasury's website, which has charts and graphs, and then also the Zero Hedge article that I talked about, Endgame, starting in 2024, all U.S. debt issuance will be used to pay for interest on the debt from May 1st, 2019. I'll attach a link to that in the information section below this video as well. Finally, did you like this short video? I spent well over 5 hours of hard work doing the research, writing, finding the charts and graphs, recording and editing to make this short video. Hopefully you enjoyed it. Please like the video, comment below the video if you enjoyed it, share it with friends and family. And if you're feeling generous, you can give me a one-time tip or donation via PayPal through my main Wall Street for Main Street website. Or you can become a monthly Patreon contributor for as little as $1 per month. Please like this video, share it with friends and family, and don't forget to subscribe to the Wall Street for Main Street YouTube channel if you have not already done so. Thanks for helping Wall Street for Main Street pass the 20,000 YouTube channel subscriber milestone despite YouTube censorship. Hopefully, we'll be able to get to 30,000 or even 40,000 YouTube channel subscribers quickly if YouTube doesn't shut down this channel. If YouTube does shut down this channel, remember to also sign up for the Wall Street for Main Street email list that's on the wallstreetformainstreet.com website and will tell you where the videos are going to be uploaded instead of YouTube. Also, if you really like the content and you decide that you want to give a one-time donation, you can go to wallstreetformainstreet.com. That's wallstreetformainst.com website where there's different options for you to do so. Or you can become a Patreon contributor. Thanks for listening, and I look forward to providing my loyal listeners with some of the best information, analysis, and financial education available out there, free or paid, as I work to grow the podcast and also get my educational technology company funded.